Okay, welcome everyone to our session on politics and society, business and economics. It's a 90-minute session, so we're going to have 3 20-minute presentations, and then we'll hold for questions until the end. We'll do one round of questions at the very end. So I am the chair of this session. My name is Kirk Doran, and I'm an associate professor of economics here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm also proud to be the co-director of one of our speakers' dissertations. And our first speaker today will be Gonzalo Letelier. Gonzalo received his PhD in law at the University of Padua in Italy, following undergraduate education in Chile. Currently, he is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Communication at the Universidad Finis Terrae, Chile. The title of his presentation today is Divine Government and the Metaphysical Foundations of the Principle of Subsidiarity. Take it away, Gonzalo.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, this is my English. It is what it is. I'm sorry. At least you have the opportunity to read some beautiful texts if you can't understand my English. My presentation has these 3 parts. I'll begin with subsidiarity as a social principle. The main source for the principle of subsidiarity is the magisterium of the Catholic Church, especially numbers 79 and 80 of Quadragesimo Anno of Pius XI, in which the term is used for the first time, and number 48 of Centesimus Annus of John Paul II, which is probably the most complete and precise definition of the principle. This is the first formulation from Quadragesimo Anno. I'm not reading it because I assume you all know it. Just I would like to make 2 points on this. The English translation renders the Latin expression subsidium afferre, from which the principle takes its name, as to furnish help. In the following paragraph, which is not quoted here, it translates subsidiari officii principio as principle of subsidiary function. The paragraph has a strong normative tone. The subsidium is presented as the appropriate mode of distribution or allocation of activities or social functions, which in practice could be performed by various communitates or societates, and the main criterion for this distribution is the relative importance. Matters and concerns of lesser importance, which would otherwise dissipate its efforts greatly, it says the text. 15 years after Quadragesimo Anno, in an address to the new cardinals, Pius XII stressed the descriptive or constitutive dimension of the principle, using practically the same words. So I would identify 2 dimensions, normative and descriptive. It says, ogni attività, every social activity is of its very nature subsidiary. It adds this part, of its very nature subsidiary. It ought to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them. The thesis would be, precisely because society is subsidiary, it must also be governed in a subsidiary way. According to the clearest and most complete formulation of the magisterium of the Church, and this is John Paul II, a community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life or of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, but rather should support it in case of need and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view to the common good. According to this text, subsidiarity is not only a rule or practical criterion that directs the decisions of the political authority to assign with justice the various social functions, but also, and in the first place, an adequate description of the way in which political society is constituted according to its very nature. So we have 2 readings of the principle. An effective way to explain this conception of subsidiarity is by contrast with what we may call contemporary conservative liberal understanding of the principle. The first presupposition of the contemporary liberal reading pretends to be rather empirical. Experience seems to prove that free private initiative is always more efficient in providing socially relevant goods than the state. A second presupposition, strictly theoretical, is a conception of freedom as the opposite of law. Where there is freedom, the free agent acts exclusively according to his or her will. Where there is a rule, to the extent that there is one, there's no longer freedom. In this context, both for reason of efficiency and of respect of individual freedom, the state should withdraw from everything it can and should give as much space as possible to free individual initiative, structured in the form of a market. This would be the negative dimension of the principle of subsidiarity. In cases where individuals are unable or unwilling to ensure the provision of a certain kind of socially relevant good, then the political authority, the state, should intervene by directly assuming this task, and this would be positive subsidiarity. Thus, the principle of subsidiarity is correctly described by the typical formulas of classical liberalism. Minimal state, as much freedom as possible, as much state as necessary, more market and less state. This vision is not entirely incompatible with the wording of Quadragesimo Anno, and this fact has helped to consolidate it also in Catholic circles. In this context, the horizontal dimension of the principles becomes some kind of spontaneous and preterintentionem mechanism of coordination between the particular interests of social agents in the logic of Adam Smith's invisible hand. In its classical version, the principle is quite more complex and interesting. The starting point is not an empirical observation concerning efficiency, but the ontological priority of intermediate societies with respect to political society, and the practical priority of the end of political society with respect to the ends of intermediate societies. Therefore, in order to achieve the political common good, intermediate societies are called upon to coordinate and support each other, subsidium afferre, in the pursuit of their own particular ends. The negative dimension of the principle of subsidiarity then consists in the respect by the higher social instances of this autonomy of the lower ones regarding their own ends. Its positive dimension, on the other hand, consists in providing the necessary means for them to achieve these ends on their own and to coordinate these reciprocal actions, integrating them into a single social common good. Finally, in those cases in which a given intermediate society is not able to fulfill a socially relevant function which belongs to it, it will be necessary that in an exceptional way, the political authority assumes this function. This substitute function, vicaria potestas, according to Centesimus Annus, coincides with that the liberal version understands as the positive dimension of the principle. The problem is, where is this conception of subsidiarity, where does this conception come from? Normally, it's said it comes from Aristotle, from Thomas Aquinas, and from Althusius, but it is rarely said where in the works of these authors it comes from. My thesis is that this conception of subsidiarity is not to be found in the political works of Aquinas, but in his treatise of the divine government of the world. In Summa Theologia, Pars Prima, question 22, article 3, Thomas distinguishes between providence and government, and that's the first point there. Providence is eternal and immediate, and government of the and the government of the world, which is equally universal but temporal, is mediate and fallible, since it requires the participation of created intellects. Thomas says, two things belongs to providence, namely the type of the order of things foreordained towards an end, and the execution of this order. As to the second, if you can read there, as to the second, there are certain intermediaries of God's providence, for he governs things inferior by superior, not on account of any defect in his power, but by reason of the abundance of his goodness. This participation of creatures in the divine government is not founded on a defect of divine power, as if it were impossible for him to immediately direct the acts of all things as a great puppeteer, but on the abundance of his goodness, so that creatures can imitate God more perfectly and participate more intensely in his goodness, being in turn the cause of the perfection of others. Because each gift is more perfectly possessed by the one who can communicate it than by the one who cannot communicate it, as it happens in teaching. Those who can teach know more perfectly than those who cannot. In this way, this very capacity of government is also a divine perfection communicated from God himself to the last of the rational creatures. Therefore, we must say God has the design of the government of all things, even the very least. But since things which are governed should be brought to perfection by government, this government will be so much the better in the degree the things governed are brought to perfection. Now, it is a greater perfection for a thing to be a good in itself and also the cause of goodness in others than only be good in itself. And he gives again the example of the teacher. So, according to the Neoplatonic scheme of Dionysius, the king and lord of the heavens established this law from eternity, that the gifts of his providence should reach the lower things through the intermediate ones. If you see, this principle is Neoplatonic, it's not Aristotelic. So the foundation of subsidiarity in Aquinas comes from his Neoplatonic roots and not from his reading of Aristotle. Thus, the perfection of the divine government is manifested in the fact that it does not govern mere subjects which obey in a passive way, but authentic rulers who can communicate to others their own received perfection. This communication of perfection is, in the first place, a communication of truth. I will skip this part because I'm running out of time. But this principle is very important because, as this text says, the end of the universe, according to St. Thomas, is precisely the communication of truth. And when Thomas explains the participation of man in this divine government, the act by which men participate in this government is precisely teaching. So it's by teaching that the order is communicated through time between persons. Following St. Augustine and the Platonic tradition begun in Plato's Meno, St. Thomas explains that teaching does not consist in the mere communication of information or knowledge, but in the communication of science, that is, in the intellectual habit of judgment. And here I put a text from St. Augustine that is very beautiful. I would like to draw your attention to this part. When the teachers have explained by means of words all the disciplines they profess to teach, then those who are called students consider within themselves whether truths have been stated. So, to learn means to judge the truth of the teaching received. According to Aquinas, I quote, "To know what you may will or what you may understand does not belong to the perfection of my intellect, but only to know the truth in reality. It's not a perfection to know the opinions of others, but to have science, and that means to judge by oneself. Because only this truth, as founded on divine truth, illuminates the intelligence causing science." In the practical order, this interior judgment is the act of imperium, either in a general way as a precept of law, or in a singular way as a judgment of prudence. By virtue of this imperative practical judgment, the agent has dominion over his own act. In biblical terms, God made man from the beginning and left him in the hand of his own counsel. This abandonment does not exclude divine providence. On the contrary, it is that in which providence consists of. So the final part of the text, human providence is included under the providence of God as a particular under a universal cause. Man's providence, by which he is able to govern himself, is contained in divine providence, so that freedom and divine decree are not opposed, because freedom is precisely the way in which God's will is fulfilled. God, as the rule of all truth, communicates his will through the natural end impressed on created natures. An end that rational creatures can only attain freely. Therefore, this end is not just proper, but strictly due. This is precisely the meaning of natural law. If you see in this text, Thomas states that difference. Irrational creatures have a proper end. Instead, rational creatures have a due end, defined by God through creation. So natural law is not a deduction or reading of norms from nature, but in an authentic self-government, it is an authentic self-government, a participated providence. This interior structure of natural law is analogous to the exterior structure of political government. In both cases, each one is law to himself insofar as he participates the order of someone who rules. This line is just beautiful. According to these principles, Aquinas explains that in every government, the best thing is that provision be made for the things governed according to their mode, for in this consists the justice of regime. Consequently, even as it would be contrary to the right notion of human rule if the governor of a state were to forbid man to act according to their various duties, so would it be contrary to the notion of God's government if he did not allow creatures to act in accordance with their respective natures. This criterion implies the risk of an error and the risk of sin. As it continues, now corruption and evil result in things through creatures acting thus. Since by reason of the contrariety and incompatibility that exists in things, one thing is corruptive of another. Therefore, it does not belong to divine providence to exclude evil from things altogether. These are just the risks of freedom, so that freedom is not the end of government, nor the end of subsidiarity, but an absolutely necessary condition to that end. So I come to my conclusions. I propose two sets of conclusions. First, some conclusions on government, and then some conclusions on subsidiarity. This analogy between divine government and human government allows some relevant conclusions proper to the ratio of government as such. First, government over rational agents means providentia sibi providentibus, providence over subjects who are provident over themselves. To govern over someone means to communicate perfection, that is, to move him in such a way that he moves himself and therefore can move others. This is only possible through a real communitas of ends. Second, to govern means to order, but the proximate measure of the perfection of government is not the immediate attainment of an intended order, as an ordo ordinatum, but the degree of communicated perfection. And third, that second point is the difference with ideologies. In the case of divine government, this is only a distinction of reason, because the providence is infallible. In human government, the perfection of government does not consist in the precise arrangement of the parts according to a preconceived plan, but in the imperfect order resulting from the free arrangement of the parts. In this logic, an imperfect order caused by the free action of the order agents is more perfect than the perfect establishment of a preconceived design through coercion and fear. And third, to govern is to communicate perfection in such a way that the one who receives it governs himself. Therefore, it is a sign of the perfection of the ruler that his direct action is not sin. Just as God is present in active everywhere, by essence, presence, and power, but he is not seen. And some general conclusions on subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity does indeed protect the freedom of the individuals of intermediate societies, but not as something that is always good and well ordered, but because an act can only be good if it is previously free. Thus, the end of political governance is not individual freedom, but a common good that can only be achieved in freedom. So the principle is not the answer to the question about how big should the state be. Political government is not a problem of provision of goods, and subsidiarity is not a criterion for the distribution of responsibilities. It's not a problem of a presence or absence of the state either. Society is subsidiary by nature. Put in these terms, the principle of subsidiarity requires the state to be present in absolutely everything, doing almost nothing, moving and coordinating as final cause, not as an efficient cause. And finally, it is possible and particularly interesting to identify the analogate of the vicaria potestas described by John Paul II in Centesimus Annus. So that activity state assumes when the particular, when the part to which it belongs is not able to accomplish it. Vicaria potestas then refers to works that are sometimes done outside the usual order assigned to things. That is the, that one is the definition, that is the Thomistic definition of a miracle. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Gonzalo. So we'll do questions at the end. Our next speaker is Brian Boyd. Brian Boyd is the executive director of the Center for Ethics and Economic Justice at Loyola University, New Orleans. He received his PhD from Notre Dame, du Lac, completing a dissertation on wage justice under the direction of Jean Porter and myself. His research also includes the nature of money, its abuse through usury, and the possibilities for a new jubilee, critical realism, corporate belonging, and cooperative social enterprises, and the social scrutiny of technology. A recipient of a dissertation publication grant from the Acton Institute, he is a James Buchanan Fellow of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, a member of the International Society for McIntyrean Inquiry, and a consultant to the journal The New Atlantis, as well as a member of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies Generations in Dialogue cohort on transhumanism and the body. Take it away, Brian.
Thanks. And I also had two of the best dissertation directors you could ever hope for, one of whom is this man, the other is Jean Porter. And so thank you all for coming. And in light of actually Jean's remarks and some other talks from this conference, I've changed to incorporate insights. So today I'm going to talk about justice and charity in economic life, beginning with the critique of Thomism, defending a critique that's given against Thomism, defending Monsignor John Ryan on the living wage, and concluding with thoughts on what infused commutative justice might look like in today's economy. So the critique is that justice is not enough. As Jean Porter pointed out in her opening talk, there is a perceived tension between charity, which is particular to persons, and justice, which is impersonal and focuses on duties and rights and roles and systems. Economists who are less concerned than theologians to uphold the unity of the virtues often accept a similar inconsistency and separation. As Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek wrote in The Fatal Conceit, we must constantly adjust our lives, our thoughts, and our emotions in order to simultaneously live within the different kinds of orders according to different rules. If we were to apply the rules of the microcosmos of the family to the macrocosmos, our wider civilization, as our instincts and sentimental yearnings often make us wish to do, we would destroy it. Yet, if we were always to apply the rules of the extended order to our more intimate groupings, we would crush them. So we must learn to live in two sorts of worlds at once. From the point of view of mainline economics, conflict between two worlds and the rules by which they operate, the family and the global economy, is resolved pragmatically in favor of the macro scale. The market will dictate what jobs are available, for whom, and at what wages. The family must adjust accordingly and do what it can. This arrangement is deeply unacceptable to critics of the present global economy. Let's consider two briefly, Alistair McIntyre and D. Stephen Long. McIntyre argues in Ethics in the Conflicts of Advanced Modernity that a public education of social influences are arranged so as to direct plain persons away from thinking in terms of common goods and natural ends, and toward thinking in terms of psychological fulfillment and contracts between sovereign individuals. With regards to wages, to take the pertinent example, McIntyre claims that, quote, what elementary justice requires is that the wages paid for week's work are sufficient to support the worker and her or his family, that the hours worked allow the worker adequate time with her or his family to pursue worthwhile activities, and that work is done in safe and secure conditions. That is, full-time employment for adults requires for justice at least a family living wage with leisure and security. This is a high bar, but it was set in Rerum Novarum and again upheld in Laborem Exercens. The needs and rights of the family are asserted as primary, and the faithful economists and business people are expected to find a way to make it work on the scale of macroeconomics. Why then have they, with few notable exceptions, not done so? MacIntyre critiques economics as an ideology which distorts, and on this view, the modern view, justice is found by following contracts, and then private charity optionally might go beyond justice to provide a living wage. Theologian D. Stephen Long offers a related critique of theologians whose thinking, in his view, has taken economics too seriously. In Divine Economy, Theology in the Market, Long uses as a central example Monsignor John A. Ryan, who, for his successful support of minimum wage laws and union drives in the 1920s and 30s, was nicknamed by his foes the Right Reverend New Dealer. Ryan based his understanding of the living wage on a three-part argument. 1, God created the earth for the sustenance of all his children. 2, the right of access to the earth is enacted through useful labor. And 3, those who are in control of the opportunities of the earth are obliged to permit reasonable access to these opportunities by persons who are willing to work. These quotes from Ryan's influential book in 1916, Distributive Justice, The Right and Wrong of Our Present Distribution of Wealth. Long faults Ryan and Thomists who have followed him as being all too willing to look at our present distribution of wealth as a thing taken for granted, with justice sought by tweaks within the system rather than requiring a radical critique. Long claims that this results in a Lockean view of absolute property rights triumphing over St. Thomas, and what is lost is the virtue of charity. It would be a damning irony if the foundational American Catholic proponent of the living wage in fact argued in such a way to make it impossible for Americans to attain living wages. And Long has a real point. There is a temptation in America has often been people claiming St. Thomas who give in to the temptation to rationalize our present system in deference to mainstream economic theory, and then to sprinkle some piety on top to make it go down better. This is saccharine and unhealthy for our souls and for our society. Yet I think a close reading of Ryan shows that he does not give in to this temptation. Recovering his arguments of the living wage in their fuller context will help us gain insight for faithful living today. So part 2, the living wage in Ryan's broader context. And again, his basic argument for the living wage is 3 parts and appeals to reason. Creation, the world is for the sustenance of us all. We enact the right to access goods through useful labor. And so if you own the land or the factories, you must give reasonable opportunities for people to earn a living in and through them. At first glance, this does seem to give priority to capital over labor, which is the inverse of John Paul II's teaching. But if you look at the broader context of the argument, you see that's not really the way Ryan frames it. There are 3 essential points: the universal destination of goods, the importance of leisure to welfare, and Ryan's critique of capitalism, where capitalism is being used formally as a class distinction between a large working class dependent upon wages and a small wealthy class which controls the means of production. For time, I'm going to just summarize these 3 points instead of argue them. So first, Ryan fully endorses the duty of distributing superfluous wealth and the universal destination of goods. He argues that justice to the poor requires Thomistic stewardship, not Lockean sovereign ownership, and this justice will not be enacted without, quote, a more effective notion of brotherly love, or the virtue of justice as informed by charity to promote the higher good. The second point is the distinction between true and false welfare. Even in 1916, it was already common that, quote, people thought to be worthwhile, life must include the continuous and indefinite increase of the number and variety of wants, and a corresponding growth and variation in the means of satisfying them. But that's not the good life. Ryan instead says the right life consists not in the indefinite satisfaction of material wants, but in the progressive endeavor to know the best that is to be known, and to love the best that is to be loved. That is, God and his creatures in their order of importance. So the good life is wisdom and charity. Ryan in no way lost sight of charity. Satisficing, rather than maximizing material well-being, is the key for Ryan to providing space in life for, quote, the interests of health, intellect, spirit, and morals. He thus anticipates Joseph Pieper's view in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, that a world of total work has difficulty conceiving of true leisure, let alone coming to hold that its possibility is due injustice to every wage worker. Not only is Sabbath rest required, but also sufficient freedom from exhaustion, physical or mental, to allow for habitual contemplation. The third and last key context for Ryan's defense of the living wage is his frankly progressive, in the 19th century sense, view of political economy. while he was willing for the sake of immediate betterment to examine and pursue the justice which could be found within his socio-economic context, he was also emphatic that the present dispensation could be dramatically improved upon. In his book on distributive justice, Ryan caps 80 pages about the nature of capital and interest, with 20 pages on cooperation as a partial solvent of capitalism. Here, Ryan argues that there is a simple and forthright way to attain Pope Leo XIII's goal that the industrious worker should become an owner of productive property, and also to reduce conflict between owners and workers. The way to harmonious distributist ownership is to increase economic cooperative enterprise, where there's a unified action of a group of persons for a common end. The too frequent situation for Ryan is a worker without capital who lacks meaningful bargaining power over wages, incentives to put forward her best efforts, and even full freedom in civic and political life. Ryan's solution is direct, private, and cooperative ownership of farms, factories, and stores that transfers capital from those who do not work to those who want to, and has the formative value of fostering, quote, initiative, self-confidence, self-restraint, self-government, and the capacity for democracy. In 1919, Ryan was given the task of writing the U.S. Bishop's Program of Social Reconstruction, a proposal for winning the peace after World War I, while disavowing socialism as, quote, bureaucracy, political tyranny, and the helplessness of the individual. At Ryan's behest, the U.S. bishops endorsed the view that, quote, the majority of workers must somehow become owners, or at least in part, of the instruments of production, not through revolution and seizure, but gradually through cooperative productive structures, societies, and co-partnership arrangements. As Ryan wrote to his sister later in life, I hope that I've been sufficiently radical. His plan was reformist in its immediate context, but radical in its full implementation. So part 3, towards a living wage today. To recapitulate, we started by noting a tension between justice and charity, between micro-scale love of neighbor and macro-scale justice in the economy. With regards to the living wage, the Church in America has noted Pope Leo XIII's claim that the dictate of natural justice, more imperious and ancient than any contract, is that wages must afford a decent life to the honest worker and his family. Yet in practice, the Church has treated this more as a counsel of perfection, a call to charity, than as a binding requirement and a grave sin which cries out to heaven for vengeance. When was the last time you heard a bishop call for unjust CEOs to be barred from receiving communion? And yet, more than a century ago, their spokesman, Monsignor Ryan, had confidently and correctly taught that the universal destination of goods and a concern for true human welfare both point to the necessity of a gradual increase in direct ownership. What relevance does this have for social teaching today? Well, as the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So I'll conclude with 4 under-argued points for future consideration. First, to clarify, we're considering a family living wage for adults, not an internship or a side gig to earn what Jean Porter likes to call pin money, just a little spending money, or petty cash. Likewise, the principle is that one standard wage should support a family, and this does not translate into a patriarchal requirement that it be the man who goes off to the salt mines. The true ideal is embodied in the Holy Family, where Joseph and Mary were both present to their child, and each contributed to the domestic economy. With increasing digital technology and productivity, we ought to call for greater flexibility in roles and more time for both parents to be physically present to their family life and joint work. Second, justice is the constant and perpetual will to render to each what they are due. And commutative justice specifies that what is due in an exchange is a proportionate correspondence. For example, an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Now, the worker gives 2 things. First, the objective productive value of their work, and second, the subjective sacrifice of their time. I once was told by a wealthy man that time is money is a saying for suckers. The shrewd know that money is time. Money is mastery over the hours, days, and years of others to buy you a longer life. So in a one-off contract or exchange, say the electrician coming to my house tomorrow, I owe him payment that justly recognizes how valuable the work was to me, and also payment that acknowledges how valuable his time is to him. This boils down to a market wage and a living wage, whichever one is higher. But in the context of a company, the worker's productivity and time are not marginal contributions, fairly repaid at their marginal value to the firm. Rather, and this goes beyond what I argued in my dissertation, the employee's effort and time are investments in an ongoing joint action toward a common end, and so even by commutative justice need to be treated as such on the principle of equivalent exchange. If you're putting in not just like a couple hours work, but a couple years work, then you're in a different relationship with the company. And so, a company is more than legal fiction or an excess of contracts. It is a community of persons. For a worker to be long-term committed to the productive ends of a company, and yet alienated from the fruitful product of the company, is to treat someone who is integral as though she were marginal. The right and just attitude can instead be seen in the Catholic entrepreneur who once told me that he had repeatedly faced the decision between paying his mortgage and paying his employees' salaries. Except it was no decision at all, because, quote, if you don't treat your people right, you don't have a company. That entrepreneur went on to have each of his 3 very successful companies make him able to pay everyone's mortgage in this room without any problem. But also, he credits their success for each of them being built from the beginning as employee stock ownership plans to create a culture of responsibility and commitment. For publicly traded companies, the benefit of reduced cost employee stock purchasing plans can be similarly indicated by commutative justice to recognize the fuller role that employees play. Third, what about the economic effects of a family living wage and employee ownership? Many economists claim that the family living wage would lead to unemployment, and employee ownership would lead to stagnation and reduced productivity. A kind-hearted concern for individuals would undermine and eventually destroy the system as a whole. All too briefly, these concerns do need to be taken seriously, but with a fundamental recognition that freedom and creativity thrive under constraint. Fundamental economic principles like the scarcity of time, diminishing marginal returns, and the relationship of supply and demand do not entail that ours is the best of all possible economic arrangements. One can have a market economy without all of society being ordered to maximal market productivity. For example, a family living wage could be pursued not through a massive hike in the federal minimum wage, but through a revitalization of the Works Progress Administration jobs program, with a living wage provided to jobs promoting the public good, as determined by the local community. This would create a wage floor with which private employers would have to compete, rather than a mandate with which they would have to comply. Likewise, employee ownership could be furthered not only by strikes and sit-ins, but also by simple changes to the tax code, such as eliminating the payroll tax for workers who are also co-owners. It is true that these efforts would probably still lower the GDP as a whole, but they would raise the quality of life and standard of living for the poorest American workers and their families. If, like Father Ryan, we have a proper understanding of true welfare, and we view wealth as a means rather than an end in itself, the trade-off should be easy to accept. Fourth and finally, are all these kind of proposals justice or charity? Long faults Ryan for making some arguments that appeal strictly to a rational recognition of the abstract equal dignity of human beings, and Long has a point. The situation is perhaps like the need for the moral law to have been revealed. Reason at its best can come to a grasp of the truth, but revelation confirms it and makes it a stable foundation for society. That a living wage is due the worker by commutative justice, in principle, does not require faith or charity to recognize, but in practice it sure helps, especially if we're seeking not only better material standards, the fight for 15, but also the need of each person for contemplative leisure. Angela Knoebel, earlier at this conference, spoke of putting on virtue as the choice to act upon the infused virtues. The example she gave was growing in infused justice by foregoing a luxury which one might lawfully accept. This is precisely the attitude which Catholic teachers and clergy must preach, and Catholic business leaders must learn to embrace. As Monsignor Ryan concluded the 1919 Bishop's Program of Social Reconstruction, this is the human and Christian, in contrast to the purely commercial and pagan ethics of industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Our final speaker is Elisabeth Kincaid. Elisabeth Kincaid is the director of the Institute for Faith and Learning at Baylor University, where she also serves as Associate Professor of Ethics, Faith, and Culture at Truett Seminary and Affiliate Professor of Management at the Hancomer School of Business. She received her PhD from Notre Dame and previously held the Legendre Soulet Chair in Business Ethics at Loyola University, New Orleans. Her first book, Law from Below, How the Thought of Francisco Suarez, S.J., Can Renew Contemporary Legal Engagement, was recently published by Georgetown University Press. Elisabeth will speak on Aquinas and the formation of the virtuous business person in Catholic social ethics. Take it away, Elisabeth.
Thank you, Kirk. Thanks to all y'all for being here. It's nice to see so many friendly faces at the tail end of the conference, and thanks to my co-panelist for very stimulating talks. I look forward to our discussion once we get through my paper. So this is a paper in 4 parts, and I'm only going to provide 2 of them. I'm going to skip over a section discussing Catholic social thought, and I have not yet finished formulating my constructive section at the end, so maybe our discussion will produce this. I'm going to spend some time just doing a little bit of a close reading of Scripture and a close reading of Aquinas. So let's start with Scripture. In Luke 16, Jesus tells a very strange story. The protagonist is an unjust steward. His master calls the steward to account for his mismanagement of the possessions entrusted to him. The steward, in a panic about his future employment prospects, goes out on the road seeking his master's debtors, and without any authority to do so, audaciously writes down their debts. In a plot twist, the steward is not punished for his egregious breaches of fiduciary duty, but rewarded by his master for his shrewdness. Jesus ends this parable with a cryptic commentary. The children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into eternal homes. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever was dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you a property of your own? In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a different story with an apparently contradictory point. You know how this one goes, too. A rich man goes away on a journey, leaving 3 stewards responsible for various amounts of his money. When the master returns, he finds that 2 of the servants have wisely invested the money, doubling the amount which they are able to hand back to their master. One servant, however, buried the money in the ground, knowing that his master was a hard man who reaps where he did not sow and gathered where he had not scattered seed. Upon seeing that his servant had generated no return with his investment, the master proves he is indeed a hard man. While the servants who were prudent investors were rewarded with more and enter into their master's joy, the other servant loses his seed capital and is cast into outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. As Jesus explains to his disciples, these parables are not just about better or worse investment practices, but rather convey deep truths about the economy of salvation. However, they do raise serious questions about the literal subject matter, money management, how it's related to salvation, and to the human journey towards sanctification. Read together without further reflection or theological commentary, the 2 parables seem to indicate 2 different poles which Christians can have to what we should do with money entrusted to us by another. Are we supposed to be generous, like the unjust steward, writing off people's debts, or responsible? The unjust steward in Luke is rewarded for his shrewdness in lavishly dispersing the wealth of his master in order to win worldly favor from other people. The servants in the parable of the talents in Matthew are rewarded when they wisely invest and increase their master's goods. Of course, in one sense, these are questions for all of us. We each possess money and goods, which are not actually ours, but God's, which have been entrusted to us for our use, a point Aquinas notes repeatedly whenever he speaks about money. But I think on a professional level, the tension between these 2 poles raises questions which go beyond issues of personal finance to include questions as to what business people should be doing with money entrusted to them, which belongs to somebody else, here on earth, not just to God. These are people who are stewards according to earthly perspectives. Considering how earthly stewards navigate the tension between these 2 poles, raise questions related to key concepts in business ethics, such as fiduciary duty, shareholder ethics, and managerial responsibility. And how these parables relate to these questions is the constructive section I'm not giving today, but we can talk about it if y'all want. So Christian approaches to business ethics can easily swing towards one of these poles. In one approach, discussions of wise stewardship can prioritize a view of business as normal. I think that's part of what Brian was concerned about, focusing on maximizing profits as the responsibility owed to shareholders or stakeholders. Potential eventual acts of charity and generosity are treated as another category of activity altogether. John Wesley would famously encapsulate this lesson, which he took away from the parable of Luke 15 with the maxim, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can, indicating a sharp episodic separation between the life of commerce, where you earn all you can, and the life of Christian charity, where you give all you can. And that's the way, I think, if you were to look at a lot of surveys of kind of Christian approaches to business and work, you would see this, particularly in some of the kind of evangelical or mainline denominations. On the other hand, Christians taking an approach which leans towards the generosity pole can disdain standard business activities and uphold radical practices of generosity as the only goal of Christian business practices. David Cloutier was discussing this poll a little earlier and described it as the Yay Socialism poll. I think that we can see both of these polls show up in Catholic social thought. It's another section I'm not including, but just I'll note that as we look at Rerum Novarum, we'll probably see a heavier accent, although not total, on the responsible stewardship side. And I think if we look at more recent Catholic social thought, the current Pope, but also John Paul II and Pope Benedict, you see perhaps a greater accent on the radical generosity side, particularly in some of the discussion they do around debt relief. So I'm not going to talk about that, but just want to note that this is, I think, important for Catholic social thought as well, although you don't perhaps see the stark, you see accents instead of the stark bifurcation you can see in Protestant approaches to this. So in the time that remains to me, I'll argue that Aquinas' conception of the connection between the virtue of liberality and the practice of almsgiving, one a virtue connected to justice and the other a practice connected to charity, offers potential for a more unified approach to Christian business ethics, which enable us to escape the tension between these two poles of generosity and responsibility. So stewardship can be viewed as an appropriate stewardship, money management, business ethics, can be viewed as an appropriate exercise of the virtue of liberality as well as of charity. So I think as we look at how Aquinas talks about these virtues and practices, he actually helps us bring the poles together. And I think he helps us read these parables together in a way that is more faithful to canonical reading. So to that end, I want to start looking at how Aquinas actually deals with both of these parables, and he deals with them quite a bit. I'll begin with his discussion of Luke 16, the unjust steward. He doesn't have a commentary on Luke, but if you go through his corpus, you'll see that he comes back to Luke 16 pretty repeatedly. So I want to just pull out a few key instances of his reference to Luke 16. The Secunda Secundae, question 55, his discussion of prudence, and section on prudence, he uses the example of the unjust steward in Luke 16 as the exemplar of worldly prudence. He writes that the steward is motivated to forgive his debts because of his desires for, quote, external things of the world on account of the flesh. Thus, the steward's lavish dispersal in this read is not virtue but vice. But I think it's interesting that he brings in the idea of justice. The reason that we don't want to be like the steward is because he's both an example of bad prudence, but he exemplifies a failure of justice in unjustly dispersing his master's good. In his lecture on Romans 12, he uses the figure of the unjust steward again, but this time the steward is an exemplar as to how we should give alms, how we should prioritize our gifts. Here, the steward is actually a model of charity as opposed to a warning against injustice. Aquinas describes how, when we give, we should give to the just first in order to maximize our investments. When we give to just people, they're more likely to pray for us, and their prayers are going to make us a good return. And he quotes Luke 16:19, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous mammon, so then when it fails, they may receive you into their eternal habitations. So reading these two examples together, Aquinas seems to point that Luke 16 stands as a warning about improper desires for worldly goods, unjustly obtained, but also a model of the proper way to use a gift which has come to all, namely charity, particularly charity related to almsgiving. So he's reading these in these two separate places as justice, injustice in this case, and charity brought together. He makes a third reference to Luke 16, which is relevant to my argument, actually in his commentary on Matthew 25, where he alludes back to Luke 16, showing that these parables are clearly linked in his reading. I'm going to talk about Matthew 25, and I'll return to Luke 16 at the end. So in most of his pretty long exegesis of the parables of the talents, Aquinas focuses upon the spiritual reading of the parables, most explicitly the nature of the master, who's Christ, and the talents, the types of gifts that these servants receive. However, he also pauses to describe the parable as providing an example of the proper exercise of the virtue of liberality. So what does he tell us about liberality? First, he notes that the master precedes those to whom he gave. Aquinas seems to find it significant for the virtue that it's not responsive to a debt or an obligation to these specific people, to these servants, but rather that the entrustment of money arises from the master's prior initiative. Aquinas also uses this to note the divine liberality differs from human liberality because giving does not diminish the opportunity for the later practice of the virtue for God, since God never runs out. Secondly, the master exemplifies liberality in that he gave abundantly as a reward to a faithful servant. Aquinas argues that giving abundantly, according to liberality, does not contradict justice. The master gives something in response to the debt owed to the services for servants rendered. The servants had done a good job, the first two, with what they'd been given and been faithful stewards. However, the virtue of liberality means the master responds to the servant's responsibility by offering an award beyond what justice would require, placing the servant over many things and not just a few talents, and inviting the servants to share in their master's joy. The abundance is not only about quality, but about the nature of the gift. So he gives more, and then he gives them different things, not just like interest on the talents. He returns to this point later in his commentary on the master's mode of giving, where he refers back to Luke 16, tying the two parables together. In considering what the master gives, he points out the master's liberality is not simply giving abundantly, makes the point the few things, the talents, are the things of this life, because there is nothing compared to heavenly things. Hence, Jesus wishes to say, because you have been faithful with regard to good things, I have placed the good things which belong to the present life, I will place you over many things. I will give you spiritual things which are above all these goods. And here he references Luke 16 again. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in that which is great. So in this discussion of Luke 16 and Matthew 25, we see Aquinas consistently returning to these two poles I pointed towards, and these questions around responsible Christian use of money, responsibility, and radical generosity. But it's interesting that he doesn't view these parables as separate, and he doesn't, at least in the scriptural commentary, seem to see this tension that we might feel, nor does he see the practices of liberality or giving as oppositional or episodic. So I think following his lead in referencing liberality and almsgiving, justice and charity, we can envision Christian business ethics as incorporating both justice and charity in the actual use and distribution of money, whether our own or that of other people. So my third part, I'm just going to spend a little more time looking at his very systematic discussion of liberality and almsgiving in the Summa, which will kind of feed back into and elaborate on these exegetical comments he makes on the parables. So let's turn to his systematic description of the virtue of liberality, which he discusses in Secunda Secundae, question 117. So what is liberality? So Aquinas begins by pointing out a verbal connection to open-handedness, largitas, and setting something free, liberat. God himself is the paradigm of liberality for his prioritization of mercy. To explain the foundational reality of God's mercy, Aquinas writes, in every work of God, there appears mercy. In God, mercy does not contradict justice, but goes beyond justice. Quote, out of the abundance of his goodness, he bestows upon creatures that which is due to them more bountifully than is proportionate to their desert. So just like the master in the parable of the talents. But Aquinas emphasizes strongly that this action of giving more is not contrary to justice, nor does it do away with justice. He writes, less would be necessary for preserving the order of justice than what divine goodness confers. So we have God as kind of this exemplar, but humans don't have the capacity to bestow divine mercy. So therefore, when we think about how humans demonstrate liberality, he's very specific, and he says this is about the good use of money. Liberality, somewhat uniquely among the virtues, is cultivated especially by those who have been granted riches. So you have to have money to be able to use it, and he makes the point that through Cultivating liberality, you may obtain the merit of being a good steward. So once again, pointing us back to this emphasis on stewardship that he sees. And I think obviously he thinks this is important, since we all know that for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven is harder than going through the eye of the needle. So apparently rich people really need a special virtue. So the liberal person is the person who honors God's gifts, these gifts of money this person has received, serving as a steward, quote, using well the things of the world that are granted us for our livelihood, while always remembering all things ultimately belong to God. The freedom, liberat, from which liberality takes its name, is not simply a descriptor of the mode of giving a gift, that we give freely, how we do it, but actually the freedom from the tyranny of the love of money that can limit and control us. The person who possesses liberality is free to actually put money to its appropriate use. And Aquinas very helpfully spells out for us what this appropriate use is. He says it's first, to meet our own needs and those of our families. Second, use it for the good of others. And third, use it for God's glory. In this list of the proper three uses of money, Aquinas points once again to these two poles of generosity and responsibility. Responsibility refers to the money we use for our appropriate needs, our costs and expenditures, he says, and generosity, the gifts that we give to others and for God's glory. And to kind of circle back to my point about business ethics, and people who are managing other people's money, he says this good use goes beyond spending money well. It includes managing it well until we do spend it. Aquinas writes that the virtuous person must be prepared, not only have the object and use it well, but they have to be prepared to use it well, creating the conditions of the possibility that make that good use possible. So, just as that exemplar of fortitude, the soldier keeps his sword sharp and ready, the person who possesses liberality will keep her money in preparation and safety in order to make fitting use of it. So far so good, but what does this actually mean? And I think I've thought about this a lot from teaching undergrad business ethics, and the two questions, students want to ask is, how far is too far? So I think we also have this question, not only in discussing sex, but in the challenging area of money. So fortunately, since liberality, according to Aquinas, is a connected virtue to justice, it has a real mean. I'm going to skip my section where I discuss that, but we'll just note that the real mean refers not to strict moral debts, but to a certain moral equity, which conduces to greater rectitude. So it's a moral due, not a legal due, and it's based on fittingness and not on obligation, and fittingness is defined by proportionality. Proportionality, again, incorporates generosity and responsibility. The person who possesses liberality will give proportionally in a way that provides the possibility to satisfy debts and obligations to do injustice, but also the obligation to provide special care according to the order of charity to ourselves, those united to us by familial and relational bonds, and those in great needs, which is the point he makes in Romans 12 when he's actually talking again about the steward. So I've got 2 minutes. I'm going to skip over the rest of my discussion of liberality and touch briefly on almsgiving. So talking about liberality, what's missing here is any type of effective response or engagement. Liberality is just about what do I do with my money? And this is right, he says, right. Liberality doesn't depend on emotions or affections towards the recipient of one's largesse. Rather, it depends upon freedom from the love of money. So it's a freedom from, not a freedom for. And I think we can say, great, this is helpful, but this type of dispassionate giving, simply in accordance with justice, doesn't seem to be the fullness of what we're called to as Christians. Jesus doesn't say, whenever you give with clenched teeth and a perfect dispassionate commitment to justice. Rather, he says, give someone a cup of water for my sake. So he calls us to give out of love. And so how does love connect to liberality? And I think this is this important component for thinking about Christian stewardship. And 2 minutes, so I'll be very brief. Aquinas notes that almsgiving, when not infused with charity, is actually an action of justice governed by the virtue of liberality. So when we look at almsgiving, understood formally actually is liberality infused with charity. He writes, you can give alms as an act of liberality, materially without charity, but to give alms formally for God's sake is not possible without charity. So he goes through the same, when he talks about almsgiving, he actually goes through the same structure, that almsgiving requires proportionality, it requires caring for those in our sphere of responsibility and caring for people in need. And actually, he takes us back once again to Luke 16, where Jesus says, make unto you friends with mammons of iniquity. So he says, is this almsgiving? And following Augustine, he denies that it's acceptable to make money just to illicitly, just to give money away. He said this is being a little too close to the unjust steward. And rather, we should, the riches of iniquity here are money that we have already accrued from actions, earlier actions, driven out of an inappropriate love of money. And I thought this was interesting. Those accrued to us because of inequality based on the iniquity of our ancestors. So these are the type of riches which should be distributed. And I think here again, we see generosity and responsibility going hand in hand. It's not radical generosity isn't an excuse to give up on the responsibilities that we have according to justice. So in his discussion, we see the themes of responsibility and generosity brought together through the lens of the parables, through the discussion of liberality and almsgiving, not placed in opposition. Our generosity does not erase our responsibility, but our responsibility includes being generous. Just as God's mercy does not erase his justice does not negate his mercy. And I think Aquinas is calling us to see that responsibility and generosity are actually two sides of the same coin when we think about how Christians should think about money management, but that we should always remember the coin we distribute has our king's image on it and not Caesar's. Thank y'all very much.
Thank you to all three of our speakers. So we're going to have one question session for all three speakers, as we said at the beginning. So please, when you raise your hand, let us know who you're directing the question to, and I'll pass the microphone around. And what's that? Oh,
We're good.
you're good. Okay, good. You guys will share. I'll pass the microphone around to the questioners. So I think you had the first hand, and then I think I saw you, Antonio. Okay, so we'll go to you first. Please go ahead and introduce yourself when you ask the question. Here you go.
So I'm Stephen Waldorf, assistant professor at Catholic University, and my question is principally for Brian. So you mentioned in your remarks that the living wage can potentially reduce GDP productivity. How do you make the case publicly that the trade-off is worth it? Because presumably if productivity is less, consumption will be less, and in a kind of consumeristic society that doesn't have a kind of Catholic understanding of virtue, the love of God, of neighbors, higher goods, how do you make that case for effectively less consumption?
Yeah. Is this good? Yeah. Is that going? Is that working? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't think the American Catholic Church has had an answer for this for over a century, and that's why we shied away from trying. There's a fair amount to be said further about, employee ownership merged with some capital to spur greater productivity. You can point to empirical studies show there's the high road to profitability. Sometimes there's a win-win situation where these companies actually wind up being more productive and especially for long-term growth as opposed to just best quarterly earnings, more sustainable growth. So those cases do need to be made as best as they can by economists and sociologists. But at the end of the day, it's why all the social encyclicals, you have a collection of Word and Fire Press has a very good collection of abridged social encyclicals. It's a nice book. But the parts that you always cut out are as unnecessary, or the concluding paragraphs where there's a prayer to Mary for conversion of hearts and a recognition that until Christ is king within the soul, then none of these things will come to pass. And it's easy to be oh, well, that's just the flowery stuff at the end, but it's just true. And so, where my focus is, I'm at this small school in New Orleans, is trying to build local communities
that are capable of having a shared vision and trying to build local economies that can be resilient in the face of a broader social structure that's not going to have that same approach. But at the same time, I do think our bishops are being courageous in calling out injustices on the national or the global scale. This is one that at least deserves lip service, as it were.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Do our other speakers want to chime in on that one at all? No, okay. Our next question over here.
This is a question for Professor Gonzalo Witter. Nicholas Aroni, I'm a law professor at the University of Queensland and also a visiting professor at the law school here. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I think you've uncovered a different way of thinking about the origins of subsidiarity in Thomas's work, and I found that very interesting. A question around, though, do you need to build into your argument an account of how the general principle that you're drawing attention to applies so as to identify the particular subsidiary entities, if I can call them that Thomas at least, or modern subsidiarity theory, would recognise as being the types of orders that are subsidiary or intermediate, such as family, community and so on, various forms of association and so on. Do you need to tie it to what Thomas says specifically about those sorts of orders, what he says about families, what he says about even the mendicant orders, for example, or what he says about the different grades of government that actually existed in his time, the way he talks about cities and provinces and kingdoms, and not just, the polis in the Greek sense of that, just one entity. And so I'm wondering whether you think you need to do that, and I've just been racking my mind about whether he draws an explicit link between what you've said about divine providence and human self-government, which I think is a very powerful point. Does he explicitly connect that to the way he describes governance within those specific spheres? You drew attention to it at a state level, if we want to call it that, but of course subsidiarity is about these other institutions and their self-governance as well. So that'd be the first question. And the related question is, have you considered whether some of his followers, I'm thinking of John of Paris, for example, or we might say Nicholas of Cuse, who seem to go into more explicit detail about these orders in the way they account for it. Do we need to turn to other writers to see that explication? Because I don't think we can expect Thomas to have spelled it all out. I think he expects us to think for ourselves. So they're my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll thank you. I will start with the second answer, because the second question, because the answer is very simple. No, I don't know. I haven't studied these authors yet. As to the first question, I think there are two parts in my answer. As you probably know, manuals and handbooks usually distinguish between vertical and horizontal subsidiarity. I didn't put it in this presentation. It is in the article. I think what is normally found and seen as subsidiarity in Aristotle and in St. Thomas is this horizontal dimension of subsidiarity, which means that basically two things: that every particular society has its own end, and it should be as autonomous as it is possible to achieve this end. So, in a way that coordinates these relative ends to a common good. But this common good is not the fruit of a design, but is more or less spontaneous, because each of these society is precisely a particular society, which cannot achieve its own end, unless with the cooperation of the others. So the answer to the first part of the question is, it would be something like this: family and villages and even enterprises, if you want, are particular societies as are autonomous particular societies with their own proper end, and they collaborate quite spontaneously. So whenever you talk about these particular societies, you are describing what this horizontal subsidiarity should be. On the other hand, there's a vertical subsidiarity, which is the model of the political government, and its archetype is this divine government of the world. I think Thomas Aquinas is quite explicit in the fact that the model of every human government, not only political government, but every government, is divine government. And I think he says that precisely in this sense, so that government does not mean to make someone do something, but it means, above all, make someone want to do something. The model of this communication is precisely teaching. So you communicate truth. You communicate the truth of good, so as the one who learns chooses this end, because he sees, he judges, he innerly judges this is an authentic good to be chosen. I don't know if I answered the question. Thank you.
We have Antonio next. You can introduce yourself first, please.
Antonio Lemos, a PhD candidate here at Notre Dame, World Theology. This question is for Brian. It's about universal destination of goods. It's like one question with three parts. So first part of the question is, I mean, in a way, the principle of universal destination of goods, it's present throughout the history, of the Catholic Church. You mentioned how Reverend Ryan uses it, but we find that in Aquinas, and you can go all the way back to St. Basil. St. Basil, when he uses it, he makes reference to poor people who are dying without food and etc. Aquinas use it in the context of private property, and Monsignor Ryan is using in the context of living wages. Are we talking about the same principle here? Are we talking about the same thing? And then the second part of the question is, what are the goods that we are talking about here? They have like a universal destination. Are we talking about property? Are we talking about food? Are we talking about air and water? The living wage itself? And the third part is could labor itself, employment, being used as a good that is destined to everyone by God? And I asked that. I had a conversation with a friend, and when Pope John Paul II used that principle in relation to migrants to justify the right to migrate, and my friend suggested, well, maybe here, like the good that the migrants can claim as being universal when they move to another country is labor, is employment. So I wonder, what is your thought about that?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Antonio. I would say briefly, yes, you're right that the history you gave is exactly the right summary. I think, so I was giving a bit of slippage between the universal destination of goods and the principle of stewardship rather than Lockean absolute ownership. I was basically using them to be equivalent, although there are distinctions to be made. But I do think for these purposes, they mean essentially the same thing. That the way that the universal destination of goods gets cashed out is through holding all things as private but using them as common. So to the second point, which goods? Ultimately, like in the broadest sense, yes, it means all goods. But then the particular focus from Basil to John Ryan is the basic necessities of life. And so the goods that enable for the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like the things you need in order to have a decent human life. That's well, yeah. So that the principle that like it's not theft if you're starving, that Aquinas upholds. It's the same thing for it is theft from your worker if you don't give them enough to eat, as well as the leisure aspect, because that's necessary for a decent human life as well. And then so finally, yeah, I think that's a really important point that we view. We talk about like the market or the economy as big abstractions, but actually there are many different types of markets, and they're segmented. And so having well-ordered, well-functioning, genuinely free and fair markets is actually a important and sometimes a rare good. And so they're actually, I'd say, in economic terms, they're club goods, because you can be excluded from them either justly or unjustly, depending on what we're talking about. And so, yeah, there's a ton of work to be done for like a moral analysis of markets as public/club goods. And especially with labor, you talked about with migration, I think that'd be a really useful angle to take in interpreting the theological writings of migration. So, excellent.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm Father Steves. I teach fundamental theology at the Greg in Rome. So I'm kind of out of my depth here in moral theology, but a question for Professor Kincaid. In my own research, I discovered that hermeneutics of parables in the past decades has moved from a moral explanation or hermeneutics to a more general, also like a question of an issue of method, like why is Jesus speaking in parables? If it was just for the moral aspect, then he could have given us rules and that would have been easy. And so some kind of consensus is that the parables enable us to discover that the extraordinary is found in the ordinary. I was wondering if maybe it's surely too wide a question, but how do you think this might impact in turn the moral interpretation of parables, that the extraordinary is to be found in the ordinary? Is there some way you can see that beyond just merely applying, because there are parables where it makes no economic sense, like trading all your goods for one precious pearl is contrary to the virtue of prudence, for instance.
Yes, thanks, Father. Yeah, I think that, I mean, in a sense, okay, I'll say make two things. One, I mean, Aquinas is not reading them according to that, into that hermeneutic, and he is reading the parables into his discussion of the virtues pretty clearly, specifically these two parables. I was kind of shocked when I saw how much he went to them. But I think for our purposes, part of the extraordinary entering into the ordinary, I mean, that's what we're all looking for in our lives as Christians, right? Like when we think about these problems around sort of the disenchanted world, the lack of meaning and purpose, really the question, I think, for business ethics isn't just about like what rules we can apply. I mean, that secular business ethics has that. But how are we leading people to think about work, to think about vocation, think about calling and meaning, and that the way we engage in our work, where we, I mean, Ryan's critique, you know, that would be nice for the future, but right now, where as Americans, we spend most of our time, if we don't see God's extraordinary calling entering into our work, transforming how we are, and we don't see our work transforming us to be virtuous people who, like Angela Knoebel said, have put on Christ in what we do, like, what are we doing? So I think that, I mean, in a sense, that's the gift of that approach and that hermeneutic of parables, is to remind us, like, God's doing some kind of extraordinary things through our little everyday activities.
Yeah, thank you, Elisabeth. We got another question over here.
John Schwenkler, professor of philosophy at University of Illinois. It's a question for Brian. Just, I mean, thinking about this in the policy side. Right, one thing that's worth observing about wages that are earned by workers in this country is that by global standards, they're shockingly high, and that the standard of living that they afford, even relatively low wages, is also shockingly high by global and historical standards. And you might think that part of the problem is that those wages don't afford a standard of living in our society. And so thinking about the barrier, on the one hand, you could think about policies to try to raise wages. But on the other hand, you could think about policies to make it affordable to live on the wages, the rather high wages that are available. And so I wonder if, I mean, how does that fit into your thinking here? I mean, one way to think about it is this is just an argument for a welfare state, but you can also think about the kinds of policies that make housing unaffordable and that make it impossible to get an adequate education for your children because public schools are falling apart, or that mean that you need to own a cell phone and transport yourself everywhere in an automobile and so on. And, you know, ways that some of those are social things, and go back to the earlier question about levels of consumption that we expect, but also have to do with, you know, aspects of the built environment and the regulatory environment and so on that make it, yes, difficult to live on what's in fact quite a lot of money. So do you see that? Do you see these as like competing policy approaches, complementary policy approaches, and have you thought about the other one?
Yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely, it's complementary and essential. So you're right, the argument was incomplete without emphasizing that as a practical approach to take. Orencast from American Compass has a cost of thriving index, where he breaks out, like economists love to point out, like the cost of televisions has gone down so much, and the cost of cell phones has gone down. Well, if you factor in the quality of the cell phones, they always make that argument, like cars aren't cheaper, but they're so much cooler now because they've got all this stuff, and so they're relatively much cheaper. But then you look at it's education, healthcare, and a couple other like non-commodity goods that are just absolutely killing what used to be the middle class. And so absolutely, I think regulation has a huge part to play here. Even in things like farm subsidies, going for the kind of mass-produced fields that we find in Indiana and Illinois, as opposed to like different policies that could promote local agriculture would go to make healthcare costs not be a quarter and a growing percentage of the economy. So there are other like seemingly impossibly huge structural problems, but actually with just some good of executive action and enough national will behind it, I actually think that dramatically could improve the situation. Because you're right, just raising wages is not going to be a solution if healthcare and education keep outpacing any raises we could hope for. So thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Any other questions?
Michael Waddell from St. Mary's College. This is just kind of a quick follow-up, Brian. And I want to call you out a little bit because I think that you said some really challenging things that I think were beautiful. I want to call you out on the answer you just gave to John. So yes, national policies potentially could make those differences, but wouldn't it also be the case, though, that if, for example, the Catholic Church decided to start doing the kinds of things that you mentioned when you said, it was the last time a bishop, denied communion to a CEO, right? So, what if in the weekly homily we heard a reminder of the right to work as a point of Catholic belief? Couldn't we as a church make a significant difference in, for example, local economies and so forth, which might then compete with other economies? Yes, we might not have as high of a GDP, but people might be more interested in working in these economies because the quality of life is better and so forth. Would you agree with that, or do you think that that's just the naive thinking of a Thomistic metaphysician?
Not at all. I can go with another Catholic both and here. Yes, and thank you as well. So the very first question, I wish I had answered also, they'll know that we are Christians by our love. How do we evangelize the culture? By doing profoundly good and desirable things and just showing people what this can look like. And so Bob Kloska of Notre Dame Federal Credit Union has a great image that actually heard here in a talk in Notre Dame. He's like, it used to be the case, there were, I think it was 900 at their peak, Catholic credit unions scattered across the country. And so when you have like the church block, the square, the way that every parish now hopefully realizes that having the church is incomplete without having a school. In many parishes, it was the case that without the Catholic credit union next to the school, you're actually incomplete. You need head, heart, and hands. You need to be able to care for the whole person. And Catholic communities used to do that much better than we currently do. And so, yeah, I think having the Catholic Credit Union and investing not in a 401k, not just putting your money to whatever Wall Street you're trying to chase, but find that Steubenville, Ohio is doing this better than anyone I know of, where there's the people around New Polity are just like finding and forming new businesses and putting investments to build up the community. And St. Joseph the Worker College, I find tremendous hope in movements like that, precisely at the local scale. And again, that's what I'm trying to work towards at New Orleans. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions for our speakers? Okay, let's give a round of applause to everybody. Thank you.